The door swung open, and Benjamin and Isabella stepped inside the restaurant, their eyes momentarily adjusting to the dim, elegant lighting that bathed the room. The soft clink of glasses and the low hum of classical music set a serene tone, but the two couldn't help but feel a subtle excitement. After weeks of hectic schedules, they had carved out this evening for themselves. The hostess, recognizing their presence, offered a warm smile and greeted them before leading them through the well-appointed dining room. As they walked past tables of quietly engaged diners, the scent of fine food mingled with the gentle atmosphere of the place. She led them to a table by the window, a perfect vantage point of the city below, where the lights twinkled like stars on the earth's surface. The city's hum felt miles away as they took their seats. Benjamin smoothly pulled out Isabella's chair, a small gesture that made her smile, and she settled into the plush cushions of the booth. They sat in silence for a moment, soaking in the ambience, before softly beginning to converse. They exchanged thoughts about their day, their weeks, the exhaustion they both carried, Benjamin from his demanding role at the law firm, and Isabella from her long shifts at the hospital. Every word they spoke was laced with the relief of knowing they were no longer in the rush of their everyday responsibilities. After a few minutes, they opened the menu, scanning the elaborate options with wide eyes. Each dish sounded better than the last, but the wine list, thick with selections, caught Benjamin's attention. He picked it up, his fingers lightly brushing over the pages, but before he could share his thoughts, he noticed the waiter approaching. The waiter moved swiftly toward them. His expression was sharp, but his smile felt forced, not reaching the eyes that scanned the restaurant with detached precision. As he stopped at their table, there was no greeting, no soft "good evening" or "how are you tonight?" The waiter simply placed 2 glasses of water in front of them and without a word, turned and walked away. Benjamin exchanged a look with Isabella, their confusion mirrored in their expressions. A moment passed in silence as they tried to process what had just happened. Benjamin cleared his throat softly and called out, his voice polite but with an edge of uncertainty, "Excuse me, could we see a wine list, please?" The waiter didn't even break his stride. He didn't pause, didn't even flick a glance in their direction as he walked away. Benjamin blinked, his brow furrowing as he watched the waiter continue on, his actions lingering in the air like a fog of unspoken tension. Isabella, ever the peacemaker, placed a gentle hand on his arm, trying to ease the discomfort that now lingered between them. "Maybe he's just having a rough night," she suggested, though even she wasn't entirely convinced by her own words. Benjamin gave a slow nod, though his own doubt began to build. "Yeah, maybe," he said, but the unsettled feeling didn't fade. They waited, their eyes darting to the other tables, hoping the waiter would return. Minutes passed, their voices barely more than murmurs in the quiet space as they tried to make sense of the situation. Several minutes later, the waiter walked by again, this time carrying a tray of drinks. He didn't spare a glance in their direction, not even a passing acknowledgement that they were still waiting. The growing discomfort became more tangible. Benjamin shifted in his seat, his eyes following the waiter as he moved across the room, and then his patience thinned further. Clearing his throat, he sat up straighter, the air around them becoming charged with the unspoken weight of their silence. "Excuse me," he called out more firmly this time, his tone carrying the edges of frustration. "We're ready to order." The waiter barely paused, flicking his gaze back briefly, shrugging his shoulders as he muttered, "I'll be with you in a minute," and continued on his way without making any effort to return. The dismissal felt final, like an invitation to wait indefinitely with no intention of coming back. A long silence followed. Benjamin's hand tightened around the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Isabella's fingers curled into her palms, her heart rate picking up with each moment of blatant disregard. It wasn't just the service. It was the sting of being ignored, the feeling of being invisible. What had started as a desire for a quiet, pleasant evening now felt like a battle for attention, for respect. "Maybe we should just go," Isabella suggested, her voice soft but tinged with disappointment. "It's not worth it." Benjamin shook his head, his gaze fixed on the waiter who was now at the far side of the room, ignoring them once again. "No," he replied, his voice steady but firm. "We're here now, and we deserve to be treated like everyone else." He stood, scanning the room for a manager or someone who could step in, someone who could make sense of what had become an increasingly uncomfortable situation. But before he could take another step, the waiter walked by once more, oblivious to their presence. Benjamin's heart pounded in his chest. His thoughts raced. Was this just poor service, or was something else at play? The idea hung in the air, cold and sharp. The waiter stopped by the bar, casually chatting with other staff members as though nothing was amiss, as though Benjamin and Isabella weren't sitting there, ignored and unheard. That moment, his aloofness, his refusal to engage, was the tipping point. Benjamin stood there for a moment longer, rush of emotions flooding him, but then he walked toward the waiter, his steps purposeful. "Excuse me," Benjamin called out, his voice rising with frustration and disbelief. "We've been waiting here for almost 40 minutes. You've ignored us this entire time. What's going on?" The waiter turned briefly, his expression now one of irritation rather than apology. "I'm busy. All right," he muttered, brushing past them. "You'll just have to wait." Benjamin stood there, the words stinging, his disbelief turning to anger. His jaw clenched, and his gaze flicked back to Isabella, who had remained calm, though her face had flushed with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. She reached out to him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "We've been patient, but this isn't right," she said quietly, her voice unwavering. Before Benjamin could respond, the chef, an older man with a thick gray beard and a crisp apron, stepped out of the kitchen. He surveyed the room quickly, his eyes locking on Benjamin and Isabella. Without a word, he walked toward them, his face transforming as he took in the situation. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his tone firm yet polite. Benjamin explained briefly, his voice still laced with frustration. "We've been ignored the entire time we've been here. No one has served us, and when we asked for help, the waiter was rude." He glanced back at the waiter, who stood near the bar, visibly uncomfortable now. The chef's eyes flickered toward the waiter before turning back to Benjamin. Without another word, the chef marched over to the young man, his steps measured and purposeful. Isabella and Benjamin watched the exchange, the tension in the air palpable. The two exchanged a few words, low enough that Benjamin and Isabella couldn't hear. The chef's posture was tense as he spoke, his voice sharp and authoritative, but within moments, he turned back toward Benjamin and Isabella, his expression changing. He was apologetic now, his shoulders relaxed, though there was a quiet weight to his words. "I'm so sorry for the way you've been treated tonight," the chef said, his tone sincere. "This is unacceptable, and I can assure you this is not how we operate here. Your service will be taken care of." As he spoke, the waiter stood by the kitchen door, his face pale, looking as though he wanted to protest but knew better than to speak. The chef gave a sharp nod, his gaze hardening. "You're dismissed," he said, the authority in his voice unmistakable. The waiter opened his mouth to argue, but closed it without a sound. He turned on his heel, grabbed his things, and walked quickly out the back door, his head hanging low. There was no apology, no attempt to make amends, only silence as the door swung shut behind him. The chef returned to Benjamin and Isabella, his expression softening as he met their eyes. "Again, I am so sorry," he said. "What you experienced was completely out of line. I can only imagine how frustrating this has been for you both." Isabella exhaled deeply, the weight on her shoulders lifting just a little. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and gratitude. "We appreciate you handling it." The chef gave a small nod. "It's important to me that everyone is treated with respect," he said, his voice firm but kind. "I will make sure your evening is as it should be. Your meal is on the house, and I'll personally ensure your service from here on out." True to his word, the rest of the evening unfolded smoothly. The chef ensured that Benjamin and Isabella's experience turned around completely. Their food came out perfectly, the wine list was presented promptly, and the staff who attended to them after the incident were warm and attentive. The meal, as they had hoped, was spectacular, every bite a testament to the restaurant's reputation. But despite the fine food and the excellent service that followed, the evening carried a bittersweet undertone. What was meant to be a special night had been marred by the rude treatment they had endured. Still, They couldn't deny the relief of knowing they had stood their ground and of witnessing the chef's commitment to righting the wrong. As they finished their meal, Benjamin sat back, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We'll come back," he said, a sense of gratitude in his voice. "And thank you again. You've done more than we could have asked." The chef nodded, his expression respectful. "It takes strength to stand up for yourself," he said quietly. "I hope next time you'll come back as guests, not victims of poor service." Benjamin and Isabella stood and made their way toward the door, the cool night air hitting their faces as they stepped out of the restaurant. They walked side by side, the city lights casting long shadows on the pavement. There was a quiet victory in the air, a small sense of triumph. Though they knew the road ahead was far from easy. They had faced something difficult, but they had faced it together, and that made all the difference. And as they walked away, the weight of the night still lingered. But so did the understanding that standing up for themselves was the right thing to do. They didn't just leave the restaurant. They left with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that the fight for respect and fairness was one worth fighting. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video, and don't forget to share it with friends and family who love heartfelt tales.